Okay. This is controlled burn, stages of a fire. Stage 4, decay, smoldering, glowing. With a decrease in fuel or oxygen, a fire smolders down to embers and ash. This is a dangerous phase because an introduction of a new fuel or increase in oxygen could reinvigorate the fire. This is usually the longest stage of a fire. It often takes weeks to fully extinguish all embers and begin the process of decay and regrowth. Chapter 23. The fire raged that afternoon. Crews were brought in from hundreds of miles away, quickly doubling, tripling, and quadrupling the population of thistledew. The rain began in earnest around dinner time, helping to keep the flames from spreading as quickly as they would in dry weather. But after months of little to no rain, the forest was a welcome host to the fire, and it continued to spread and smolder long into the night. The crews fighting the blaze dug trenches and cut a fire line around the area, hoping to contain it. The Forest Service made the decision that this was part of the forest was due for a fire, and since conditions were favorable, high humidity, decreasing winds, and cool wet weather, they decided to allow for a controlled burn. Then containment lines were drawn far outside town, and crews kept the fire from spreading up the hill near the fire tower, so me and Grandpa's part of the forest would be preserved. But much of the area around it would burn, making way for decay and new growth. Grandpa Howard desperately wanted to help fight the fire, but they told him he was too injured to go out and help clear brush, or actually battle the blaze. His ankle was sprained, and he needed a few stitches where he had sliced his leg open in the woods. But luckily, he hadn't broken any bones. After Grandpa argued with and grumbled at his Forest Service pals, and even went as far as trying to sneak out of the truck with one of the fire crews, someone asked if Pops would be willing to help out with the Fire Communications Command Post. He reluctantly agreed to stay put in the Forest Service Regional's offices, where he could help direct crews and keep people informed about what was going on. As always, I called my parents that night to check on my sister and to tell them about the day's events. Amelia was doing much better. The fever had broken and the infection was gone. She was actually awake and alert enough to be on the FaceTime call with my parents while I told my story. For the first time since I had left home, I saw her face. The burns had left her scarred and somewhat unfamiliar looking, and under the thin bandage of a hat on her head, I knew that her hair was gone altogether. She was wearing a soft t-shirt, not a hospital gown, which gave me hope that she was moving toward a more normal life. Then that maybe she would eventually get to leave the hospital. It was a relief to see some of the old sparks still in her eyes, and I was filled with total joy when I heard her laugh as I told them of the spam collection in Grandpa's fire tower. "I'm so glad you're safe," Mom said after I finished the whole story. Her voice was thick with emotion. I noticed then that my sister had drifted off, asleep and peaceful in her crisp white bed. She would be moving from the hospital's burn unit to a rehab facility very soon, where specialized staff would continue to help her with her recovery from the burns. And she'd have more frequent physical therapy, too, to help get her body moving again. She still had a cast on her leg, but once that came off, the PT would help get her legs back in shape after the break and so much time in bed. "We have something to tell you, too," Mom said quietly, as not to wake Amelia. The fire department arsons investigator finally confirmed the official cause of the fire today. I held my breath waiting. This was the conversation I'd been avoiding for weeks. They're 100% confident that the fire was caused by faulty wiring in the basement, Dad said. That's what they had been assuming, but because the damage of the back half of the house was so severe, it took some time for them to confirm it for certain. "It wasn't my candle?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It definitely wasn't your candle," Mom said, and she and my dad shared a look and then turned back to me. "Maya, honey, Grandma told us about your conversation yesterday. I had no idea you'd been holding on to this kind of guilt about what happened." I didn't say anything. I didn't think I could. Dad said, "Just so you know, I've blamed myself plenty of times too, kiddo." "Why?" I choked out. "I'm the one who wanted a new electrical panel," he said. "If it weren't for me, they wouldn't have been playing with the wiring in the walls. Houses like ours with old electrical systems are usually fine until someone starts fiddling with them and knocking things loose. I can't stop wondering what might have happened that night if I hadn't left you girls alone, Mom added. I'm also the only one who knew the contractors had disconnected some of the wiring that week while they worked. I should have checked the smoke detector battery. That's all on me. Her voice got husky, and even though the connection on the video wasn't great, I could tell she began to cry. There are so many what ifs, Maya. So many. It's not all on you, Dad said, pulling Mom close. I nodded. The three of us sat there quietly for a few moments. None of us is to blame, I said finally. It was a fluke, a terrible accident. I thought about what Grandpa and I had talked about that morning on the way up to the top of the fire tower. I couldn't believe we had had that conversation less than 24 hours ago. The only thing we can do now is to stop wondering what might have happened if things had gone differently and figure out how to move on from here. Mom glanced at Dad and they both nodded. You're absolutely right, Maya, Mom said, sniffling. It doesn't help anyone if we keep dwelling on it. Dad sighed. It's definitely hard not to keep going over and over everything and wish I could go back and change so many things leading up to that night, he said softly. It felt reassuring somehow to hear my parents, two smart adults, sounding uncertain and scared and guilty. I wasn't alone. Maya made a good point, Mom said, as much to me as to Dad. We all have things we wish we could change about what happened, but it's pointless and harmful to look back since we can't rewind time. All we can do now is focus on what's ahead of us. We all have a lot of healing to do, and we should be focusing our energy and time on that. As we sat on the call for a while longer, saying nothing more, just thinking and being together as a family, before we hung up, Dad told me he was going to book a ticket to fly in the next afternoon. I was excited to see him without a screen between us and talk to him about all of this more in person and just give him a hug. I also couldn't wait to introduce him to Bear and to Wilma and Griffin. The next morning when Grandma picked up Dad at the Hibbing airport, I stayed behind to cuddle with Bear, who was still totally exhausted from his big adventure in the forest and brushing in the bath that he had been subjected to afterward, and keep watch over Wilma. I also stayed back because it was mine and Griffin's last day of swimming lessons, and I didn't want to miss it. Wendy drove us to the lake a little early so the three of us could have a picnic dinner on the sand and watch the swim instructors and the lifeguards set up the inflatable climbing wall and slide out past the buoys. From the moment we arrived at the lake, Griffin was bursting with excitement. He had finally gotten comfortable with paddling, almost to the edge of the swim area without his life jacket on, and he could tread water longer than anyone else taking summer lessons. Because I vowed to support him through this journey, I could do it all this now too. So both Griffin and I earned ourselves a ticket out to the climbing wall and slide as a prize for passing our swim test. The twins, on the other hand, had not. Ellen and Hannah still refused to even try to get in the water without life jackets, despite the fact their mom kept yelling at them from the shore to just try. They told Griffin and me they planned to skip the last class, rather than watch the rest of us get to celebrate and play out in the water on the inflatable slide. Griffin and I felt proud, being the only two from our swim group who had actually passed the course. When it was time for our final session to start, Evan headed over to collect me and Griffin from the beach. You ready? He asked, high-fiving each of us. Griff, bud, you feel good about swimming out to collect your prize? Griffin glanced at me, and I gave him an encouraging nod. I can't wait, he said. But if I decide I don't want to slide down or jump off the top of the climbing wall, is that okay? You do whatever you're comfortable with, pal, Evan said, grinning. I and Jenna and Annika, the two lifeguards, will be out there the whole time to make sure you're safe. I just want you to celebrate how much you've learned this summer. Remember how you were afraid to even float in the lake when we first started this class? I remember, Griffin laughed. Next, Evan looked at me and Maya. Are you feeling ready? He wiggled his eyebrows and his shaggy beard wiggled along. Have you thought about what I suggested, about maybe trying to swim out a little farther, all the way out to the wooden raft? Let's see how this swim goes first, okay? I answered. Evan laughed. Fair enough. Slowly, Griffin and I waded into the water. Griffin yelped when the chilly water splashed up to his belly button, and again when it was up to his armpits. But we both kept going side by side, and eventually we were happily treading water out in the part of the swimming area where we could no longer touch. Ready? I asked Griffin. Let's do this, he said. Then he took the deep breath and put his face in the water. Awkwardly, he started paddling a messy front crawl out toward the giant inflatable slide. I swam along beside him, holding my own head above water, so I could keep an eye on him. I knew Evan and Annika and Jenna were nearby too, each pulling a floating ring on a rope just in case either of us got tired and needed a break. But it made me feel better to have my eyes on Griffin too. At the edge of the marked swimming area, we paused. Griffin and I each grabbed the slimy rope strung together between the line of buoys. All that was left was to duck under the rope and we'd be there. I lifted the rope high above the surface of the lake so Griffin could swim underneath first. 2 easy strokes later, he grabbed the edge of the big inflatable slide and pulled himself up and out of the water. Yes, he hollered, pumping his fist. We made it. I scrambled up beside him, and Griff wrapped his arms around me in a wet hug. We both started to climb up to the top of the inflatable climbing wall. At first, we kept sliding off, falling back into the water or into the bouncy surface down below. But after a few tries, Griffin managed to get to the top. I wasn't far behind. The best part was sliding down the inflatable slide attached to the climbing wall, landing with a plop in the huge lake below. After lots of turns, Griffin decided he needed a little rest and lay down on the sun on the tippy-top part of the wall. Evan looked at me. What do you think? You want to keep going to the wooden raft? He winked. I wouldn't let you try it if I thought you couldn't swim that far, but I need to make sure that you think you're ready to do it. I nodded. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. This wasn't entirely true, but I was an exceptional swimmer. There was plenty of room for me to improve my skill and confidence in the water, but I was good enough that I knew I could probably swim to the raft without any real struggle. And the more important thing was that I felt ready. A few weeks ago, there was no way I could have attempted a swim challenge like this. But now, after everything else I dealt with this spring and summer, and swimming out to the raft actually felt achievable. Will you be okay by yourself? I called up to Griffin. I got Annika to keep me company, Griffin replied, giving the lifeguard a thumbs up. As I set off heading out into the even deeper part of the lake, Griffin cheered me on. This really helped me keep going whenever I felt tempted to turn around and give up. But after all those hikes up to the tower and our swim lessons with Evan, I was in pretty great physical shape, and soon I found my natural rhythm in the water. I took long, slow, steady strokes, just the way Evan had taught me, and I was careful to breathe to the side, rather than lifting my whole torso up out of the water with each breath to help conserve my energy. This strategy also kept my legs from dropping into the murky depths below, where I still worried that there were enormous fish waiting to munch on my toes. When I flipped onto my back to get my bearings and take a few easy breaths, just like I had done with Grandma just like I had done with Grandma when we were in our floating diapers, I saw that I had already more than halfway to my goal. A few of the old swimmers were waiting for me out of the raft, and everyone was cheering with a smile. I rolled back over to my stomach and continued my victory swim. As I pulled through the final stretch, I considered how much both my sisters and I had gone through this summer. Until now, Amelia's healing had been mostly physical. Mine was a summer of emotional healing that had ended with huge physical challenges. The cool thing was, I had swum out into the middle of the lake all by myself. I could actually see how much I had changed. I decided to ask my parents about starting counseling when I got home to help me work through some of my other worries and fears. A few of my friends saw therapists, and I realized that without having the space and the calm of the fire tower and the forest back home, I had to figure out different ways of dealing with stuff. I knew that one summer couldn't totally change who I was deep down, but being in Thistledew, away from my regular life and forced to act like Maya the Brave, had certainly helped me start to realize the person I was capable of becoming. Suddenly, my hand hit the edge of the raft. Above me, some of the older swimmers were clapping and whooping and pointing to the ladder so I could climb up and join them. With a huge, exhausted breath, I rolled onto the wooden raft and lifted my arms into the air like a hero. I looked back at Griffin, who was waving to me from his perch at the top of the inflatable climbing wall. Then I glanced toward shore, where Wendy was pumping her arms in the air and hollering congratulations. That's when I saw two familiar people jogging across the beach from the parking lot. My dad and my grandma had made it in time to witness my big victory. They both waved to me, and I waved back, giving them a big thumbs up. I stood in the center of an old wooden raft for a minute, taking in my surroundings and congratulating myself. Smoke that had drifted for miles from the forest fire cast everything in a sort of foggy, magical haze. Warm late afternoon sun beat down on the tips of the cedar white pine trees lining the edge of the lake, bathing them in the orange glow. The water glittered around me. As I curled up on my toes around the edge of the wooden platform, preparing to jump back into the water and return to Griffin, I realized something. I was ready to go home. I missed Grandpa Howard and Grandma Bee, Griffin and Bear, and of course little Wilma. But it was time. I needed to go, and now I knew I was really and truly ready to support my family whenever they were ready to begin the emotional healing that would come next. If my parents didn't have room in their hotel room for me, I'd already talked to Beckett and Anne. They'd both said their families were happy to have me take turns staying with each of them so I could be closer to my sister. It was time. With a big smile, I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and jumped, cannonballing into the deep water. For the first time in forever, I wasn't scared of the unknown.